Hey everyone, this is Dr. Jacobs here. I wanted to do a video lecture to get you all started for the semester. So I look forward to working with you all across the semester. So let's get started. Welcome again, welcome to Lifespan Development. The module that we're doing this week is actually the foundation for the entire rest of our semester. So although there may not be as much content in this first module as we'll see in some future modules, this is going to be a very important framework for how you're going to approach this class and the different information that we're learning. So there's been a couple questions. So to access the Waymaker materials, you're just going to click on those links that we have in our Blackboard site. So LMS stands for our Learning Management System. Here at UCM, we've used Blackboard since the entire time I've been here. I don't see that changing anytime soon. But the way that you access the materials, you'll just click on those links. Some people asked, well, yes, my light just went off in my office. So if I can dance, it won't see me. So we're going to be doing this in the dark, it looks like. But you just click on those links and it'll take you right into your reading. So each week you'll have a reading that you'll do. You'll also have a quiz that you'll do, which will be for points that we learned about in our syllabus. So it's just very easy. You don't have to download anything. You just have to have an internet connection and click onto those links. So the entire semester is going to be broken up into modules. Sometimes these modules will be 1 week long. Sometimes they'll be a couple weeks long. And so if you have a module that's a couple weeks, there's probably going to be a little bit more work than the 1 week module. So you want to get started on those early, especially if at the end of the second week, we have some sort of exam. All of our exams are going to be taken using a software called Blackboard Respondus Monitor, also known as the Lockdown Browser. Yes, that is a required part of our class. So if you're struggling to get that to work, you got to make sure that you're downloading the software first. And then you're clearing out of everything on your computer. So closing all tabs and then going to the icon, the picture that accompanies how you open the software that's downloaded onto your computer. All of the computers in JCKL actually have the software already preloaded into it in their study rooms. So you would just go and check out a webcam, and then you could take your exams or your pretest in those study rooms. Okay. So this is our first module. It's just called Lifespan Development. You're going to want to make sure that while we're going through these different lectures and these different materials that you're taking notes. Lifespan Development is actually covering everything from conception through death. So we're going to learn a lot of different information and hopefully have some fun while we're doing it. Our next module after this one will be called Developmental Theories. In that unit, we'll go over some of the foundational lifespan development theories, which we'll learn more about for the most part throughout the rest of the semester. In the past, this is actually fairly new materials for us. In the past, these two chapters actually had been approached at the same time. And so this will be the first time that I'm teaching the introduction to lifespan development separate from learning about these pivotal developmental theories. After we learn about the developmental theories, we're going to go into each of the individual stages of the lifespan. So the very first one that we're going to learn about is prenatal development. After that, we're going to go into infancy and toddlerhood. So even though the module is called infancy with our materials from our book, it's actually going to encompass both infancy and toddlerhood. Then we'll move on to early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. Something that you'll notice about our materials is that they break up adulthood a little bit differently than what most developmentalists do. And we'll talk about that. So most developmentalists would have prenatal development, infancy, toddlerhood, early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, and then we go to emerging adulthood, which actually was coined by a professor who worked at the University of Missouri, which is kind of cool. Then they would just say adulthood and late adulthood. So when we get into those latter modules, we'll probably talk about that a little bit more. So in our syllabus, there were some course learning objectives, and these are the big picture items that I want everyone to be able to take from our class and be able to do by the end of the semester. So for example, I want you to be able to identify the developmental stages at different periods throughout the lifespan. You'll actually be able to do that by preliminarily by the end of this lecture, but we will learn across the entire semester really detailed information about each of these developmental phases. I also want you to be able to apply developmental theories learned in this class to the different stages across the lifespan. So there'll be some of these developmental theories that we'll start learning in next week's module that we'll learn about across the entire lifespan. Some of them we'll only learn about in little pieces of the lifespan because that's where they apply. And so I want you to be able to take these developmental theories and really think about how people develop across the lifespan. I also want you to be able to explain the strengths and weaknesses of developmental theories learned in this class. So although I'm going to be teaching you about a whole bunch of different theories, doesn't necessarily mean that I agree or disagree with these theories, but they are the developmental theories that we're learning about. And so with everything in life, there are strengths and there's going to be weaknesses to each of these. So I want you to be able to think critically about that and be able to apply that information to your life, to your career. I also want you to be able to distinguish between normal and abnormal development. So lifespan development actually pairs really well with another course, sometimes called abnormal psychology. Sometimes that same class is also called psychopathology or developmental psychopathology. So in lifespan development, we look at typical development, while abnormal psychology or psychopathology course looks at atypical development across the lifespan. So some success tips. You should create a Google Drive folder just for this class. And I personally would put it into my own personal drive rather than the school drive because you will eventually lose access to your UCM Google Drive account. And that way you have these materials forever in case you need them. So in that Google Drive, what you should do is save a copy of our syllabus, save a copy of our slides and all course materials so that you have that later if you need it at some point. So if you're planning on going to graduate school or some sort of professional school, sometimes lifespan development is actually a prerequisite for the program. And so a lot of times graduate schools or professional schools will ask for a copy of your syllabus to see if this course meets the standards of what they need for the prerequisite. And so by saving that syllabus, you'll be able to let them know that, hey, I've taken this and I don't need to take it again. So a lot of people probably don't want to take the same class twice if they don't have to. Also, so when I am lecturing or you're doing readings or watching videos, make sure to take notes and really try to digest the information. Online classes are a little tricky because you are responsible for your own learning, right? I can put all the things out there. I can say, hey, this is what you need to do. Here's a video lecture. You need to do these readings. You need to create a study guide for yourself every week using unit learning objectives. But I cannot force you to do it. It's a little bit easier in an in-person class because I can remind my students over and over again. And it's a lot easier to build a relationship with students in in-person classes where they begin to trust you a little bit more. So hopefully you trust me and you'll take notes while you're doing these things. Another tip that I like to give out is that when you're doing readings, make sure that if you read a paragraph, you ask yourself, what did I just read? And if in one sentence you can summarize what you read, great, keep going. If you can't, that means you probably ought to reread the paragraph so that you can really understand what's going on in the reading. And that can be painful for people, especially people with ADHD or traumatic brain injuries, to be able to do that. But it is a strategy that helps get easier and it gets you thinking about it and focusing on the material while you go through it. Learn to take notes. So if we were in my in-person class, I'd show the whiteboard and be like, this is what you need to do. So for example, for this, I might have success tips. I'd put maybe a 1, make a Google Drive folder. 2, save important course materials. 3, take notes. 4, take good notes, right? Or I can combine 3 and 4. And so you don't necessarily have to write everything. It's a little bit easier though for an online class to be able to write whatever you want in notes because you can pause this video and go at your own pace, which is super advantageous actually. But at the same time, you don't want to be writing everything that's on my slides word for word. What you should actually do is listen to the lecture or do the readings and put them in your own words and then check your understanding. Like if you have a question about something, let me know and we will be able to kind of try to work through that information so that you're rehearsing it while you're going through these lectures. So now talking about unit learning objectives, you've already done the training on the syllabus, and you know that I don't provide study guides. And one of the reasons that I don't is it actually makes it harder for you to actually learn the material. So study guides often all they do is get students to mimic what the professor is saying in the exact words in the exact way, and not actually think critically about the material or how it applies to life and career fields and all these different things. So what I do provide for you each week, though, are unit learning objectives. And what you should do is take these, and by the end of the module each week, notice I'm saying each week, make sure that you can do these things before moving on to the next week's materials or the next module's materials. So for this unit, by the end, you should be able to define lifespan development in your own words. And if you notice here, it says in your own words, not in Dr. Jacobs' words. And that's because when we put things in our own words, when we translate it into what we know, it actually makes it easier for us to remember things. And we'll get through this information at some point later in the semester, but we remember things by attaching meaning to it, not just by memorizing things straight. It's by attaching meaning. So by using your own words, you're attaching your own meaning to it, which will make it a little bit easier for you to remember. I also want you to be able to explain the different domains of development. So you learned about this in your reading. There's 3 different ones. I want you to be able to describe the developmental phases and put them in chronological order. So sometimes you hear developmental phases called developmental stages. There's a few different ways you'll hear me refer to this, but this is basically looking at the different stages of life that we already talked about. So it's prenatal development and infancy, toddlerhood, early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, emerging adulthood, adulthood, and late adulthood. So being able to describe what those are, to be able to put them in order like I just did for you, you should be able to do this by the end of this unit. I also want you to be able to compare various types and objectives of developmental research. So we're going to go through different types of research design that are used in lifespan development. Although this is a class that serves a whole bunch of different majors, in real life, or not real life, but here at UCM, it's actually housed in psychological science. So this is a developmental psychology. I'm a school psychologist by trade, which is kind of a developmental psychologist. So we're looking at how things change across the lifespan, because there's some things that are normal or typical development for someone who's at age 2 that would not be typical development for someone who's 55 years old. So for example, if someone throws themselves on the floor and they tantrum and they're throwing the arms and legs, that actually is pretty typical for 2-year-olds. Now, if I'm in class and a 22-year-old throws themselves in the middle of my classroom and tantrums, that's not typical development. And so when we're looking at these things in psychology, we use that to see, okay, is this behavior typical or atypical? Is this potentially signifying some sort of mental illness or developmental disability? And so when we do that, that all stems back from research. Okay, so I also want you to be able to explain what a stage theorist thinks about how development occurs. And we will actually learn about some stage theorists next week. And then we will also be learning about stage theorists across the entire lifespan class. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So lifespan development, if I'm going to define it, is a study of how people typically progress across the lifespan. There is actually a range of what's considered typical for humans. So when we're talking about walking, which we'll go back over this later in the class, not everybody walks right at 1 year old, right? There is a range of what's considered typical. Now, if you get to 18 months in the United States, so this can also be a cultural thing too. If you're in the United States and not walking by 18 months, then that might signify some sort of developmental disability. And typically, if you are in Missouri, you may want to consider contacting somewhere like First Steps or somewhere to be evaluated to see if the state has some services to help remediate any difficulties that might cause the child issues later on in life. So lifespan is considered from conception all the way through death, and that is huge. So we're gonna have a ton of content that we're covering in this class. And so sometimes that can be overwhelming, but it's beautiful and it's fun. And we're gonna learn about so many different things. So if you think about your life from the moment you're conceived all the way through the future when you die. There's so many different things that we go through, right? We go through relationships and loss and trying to figure out who we are and if we want to partner. And if we do want to partner, who are they? And so we'll be looking at so many different things. And that's what makes this class really, really fun. So the lifespan is broken up into periods of development or stages or developmental phases. And we've already started learning about them, but we will take each of these phases and learn more in depth about them. In the past, in this class, we actually would have like 3 chapters over one developmental phase. And so when we switched these materials, they actually just lumped everything together for each of the modules, which I'm really excited about. Because that allows us to not have a lot of overlap with chapters in terms of you can just learn everything once and we can try to fit it together that way. And I'm also really excited about these materials because they are so much cheaper than the traditional textbooks. So I'm really excited about that as well. So our developmental phases or our periods of development, again, our prenatal development, infancy, toddlerhood, early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, emerging adulthood, adulthood, and late adulthood. So by the end of this slide, you should be able to meet that unit learning objective that you can be able to put the developmental phases or the periods of development in chronological order. So what you could do right now as a study tip is you could hide your screen and then see if you can list them out without having to look at your screen in the proper order. So prenatal development, this starts at conception and ends at birth. When we get into this unit, we'll learn more about the 3 stages of prenatal development, which are germinal, embryonic, and fetal stages. After we learn about the 3 stages of prenatal development, we'll learn about the stages of labor, the stages of birth. We'll also learn about pregnancy, and we will probably have a conversation about birth control. Something that really shocked me when I started out as a professor here is finding out how much students don't know about their own anatomy, what they don't know about preventing pregnancy or STIs and things like that. So I don't know how to work it out in an online class, but in my in-person class, I field a lot of questions about these things. So if you feel comfortable, ask them in the perusal assignment. If there's a question you want to know the answer to, but you don't want your peers to see that you're asking the question, you could always send me an email and I could answer that broadly for the class, but without identifying who you are, because this is really important information. I used to have an assignment where I'd have people identify different parts of the sexual reproductive organs, and people really struggled to identify what a penis was or a vagina and things like that, or ovaries and testes. And so it was really kind of disheartening. But instead of shaming people with the quiz, now I kind of just teach it and let students ask questions as we move through. Then we'll move into the module on infancy and toddlerhood. Infancy is considered birth up to 1 year of age or 1 year of age. So once you hit 1 year old, you are actually a toddler. And so toddlerhood goes from about age 1 up to age 3. Why do you think people call age 1 up to 3 years old toddlerhood? What happens around age 1? That's right. People learn to walk. And so they're toddling around, trying to figure out how to walk. Then we move on to early childhood. So with early childhood, middle childhood, and adolescence, there is some disagreement among developmentalists about what ages characterize these stages. When I teach this class, I actually don't necessarily use specific ages. So like for this one, I define early childhood as 3 years of age up to the entry of formal schooling. So some textbooks will say that early childhood is 3 to 5 years. Other textbooks will say 3 to 6 years old. This is really just 3 years of age up to formal schooling. So typically we would consider that as kindergarten, but not even in America, right? So development has a context within the culture. If we're just talking about America here, not every state actually requires kindergarten. So when I lived in Houston, Texas, at that time, they didn't require kindergarten as part of formal schooling. So that's a little bit different, because when we're talking about formal schooling, we're not talking about optional preschool or daycare. Then we'll move to middle childhood. What starts this is the entry to formal schooling up to puberty. And so here's another one of those that a lot of developmentalists will try to give ages, but the ages don't actually signify what the developmental phase is. So here, not everyone goes through puberty first or at the same time. So typically people in women's bodies will start puberty first, and people in men's bodies will start later. And it's not the same for everyone. So when they give ages, they're trying really hard to put a number on things that you can't necessarily put a number on, and everyone does everything exactly at the same time. Then we have adolescence, this puberty up to the legal age of adulthood. So in the United States, that would be puberty up to the age of 18. Once you hit 18, you're technically a legal adult. Now, and I'm saying at 18, you're an adult, and some of you might be 18 years older, you might be a little bit older than that. Do you think that you're a full adult at 18? Most people, if I ask this in an in-person class, would say no, they don't think they are. And that's why they came up with a new development, a relatively new developmental phase called emerging adulthood. So here, this is about ages 18 up to about 25 years of age. This is where people are starting to learn who they are as humans, what kind of life they want, and trying to figuring out their life path. A lot of people who take this class typically are in this range. With my online class, that's not necessarily so. A lot of times I'll have a lot of non-traditional students who are in this class and could be in adulthood or even late adulthood. So then adulthood is considered age 25 up to 65 years old. Why do you think it says it ends at 65 years old? There's actually, I could actually put a marker for this to be a little bit different. It's kind of changing too in the United States, and this can be country dependent too. So what do you think ends or marks the end of adulthood? If you said retirement, you're right. But anymore, and now I'm going to forget the year, but most of us actually cannot draw Social Security or full Social Security benefits until age 67. And so maybe this could change. But the thing about adulthood to late adulthood, we also see differences in the ability to maneuver life, right? So we start seeing some aging differences once we get to about age 65 years old and later. We'll talk about that when we get into the next phase, which is late adulthood, which is 65 years to death. And so that is the basic format of our class. We have the lecture this week, we have developmental theories, and then we're going to go through all these developmental phases in depth. Oh, here, look at me. I was good. I put it into the lecture. So retirement age in the US is 67 years old for people born after 1960. So in our reading, we learned about 3 different domains of development. Some people could argue that there's more than the ones that are listed here, but let's go ahead and review those. So there's physical development, cognitive development, and psychosocial development. And so in each of our modules, we'll be covering all 3 of these different areas within each of the modules. So when I first started out here a while ago, there was a textbook that had 45 chapters in it. And since we're expected to read all of those in a semester, and that was my first order of business, was to try to eliminate that textbook because I know that's just too much. Even when we moved on to the new textbook, they would break up these physical and cognitive and psychosocial differences in developmental phase into different chapters, which made it really disjointed, especially sometimes because some of these things overlap or work together so that you can really understand what's going on during this phase of life. So for physical development, this involves growth, changes in the body and brain, the senses, motor skills, and health and wellness. So this is basically looking at biology. This is looking at your motor development, which we'll talk about. Could be aging or even fine motor skills like cutting or writing with a pencil. All right, so again, examples of this would be like growth, motor skills, aging, Cognitive development, when you see the word cognitive, I want you to think thinking, okay? And so when we're looking at cognitive development, it involves learning, attention, memory, language, thinking, reasoning, and creativity. And so this is using our brain to learn, or being able to focus, or being able to remember things, or utilizing language, and seeing how our thinking changes across the lifespan. So examples include, again, thinking, learning, remembering, and we'll cover all of these things across the lifespan. We also have psychosocial development. This involves emotions, personality, and social relationships. This one can be people's favorite things to study sometimes. So examples of this would be like attachment or identity and different relationships. Within the class, there's going to be different theorists that look at development in different ways. So here we can look at continuous versus discontinuous development. Continuous just means there's gradual changes across the lifespan, whereas discontinuous development thinks that things happen at specific stages. They're kind of disjointed. And so when we talk about a stage theorist and how they see development, they believe that development occurs in stages that go in particular order. And we'll talk about a few different stage theorists next week, and then we'll continue those stage theories across the entire semester. So this book also talks about the lifespan perspective, which is something that's a little bit different. None of the other books that I've used in the past have actually covered this information. So we'll look at it and examine what we think about the lifespan with it. So in our book, it mentioned that lifespan is lifelong, like it doesn't end at a certain thing, that it's multidimensional, multidirectional, plastic, contextual and sociocultural influences, multidisciplinary. And so let's go through each of those individually. So lifespan development is lifelong. It occurs from conception through death. It's not something that you achieve at a certain age. It covers your entire life. All right. It's also multidimensional. So this is a dynamic interaction of these factors. So physical, cognitive, and social, emotional development and influences everything. So sometimes if you have some limited capabilities, so say like you have an intellectual disability or ID, this means that you typically have an IQ score that is below 70, and you have some reductions in adaptive behaviors. So adaptive behaviors are things like being able to button your own clothes, or being able to feed yourself, or being able to bathe yourself or get to the bathroom. That could very well influence your social emotional development, which would be like relationships, or your ability to function in different systems. And so these are different ways that they influence how an individual develops within time. It's also multidirectional. So development of a particular domain does not occur in a strictly linear fashion. So sometimes things follow kind of a fairly straightforward linear way, but it doesn't always. So for example, we'll learn about a theory called the U-shaped curve of marital satisfaction. And so when they did this research, they found that when people get married and go on their honeymoon, that's their absolute happiness. As they've been married in Western societies, the happiness falls. If they're having children, and then when their children leave, then they slowly get happier and happier. So that's a U shape. That's not linear. There's not, if you marry someone, you keep getting happy. No, it actually sees decline, and then back up. And we'll talk about that theory a little bit more, and rationale or why they think that happens. We'll talk about the research methods that they use to do that, and if it's even really a thing. And development's also plastic. So for example, sometimes the brain can be rewired even after an injury. And this goes into neuroplasticity, or how does your brain rewire itself to still function even when it may not work. And it's not always just injury either. This could be, for some reason, something doesn't work anymore. So they're saying that not everything in life is completely stagnant. Sometimes there's some flexibility within development. We also have contextual and sociocultural influences. And so the book went through something called normative age-graded influences, normative history-graded influences, non-normative influences. And let's go over these in a little bit more detail. So for normative age-graded influences, these are things that influence the lifespan or the development of an individual connected to chronological age or some sort of expectation for social practices. So what are some examples of this that weren't in your book? So when I'm asking these questions, why don't you shout them out loud to yourself, even if there's no one here? These are ways that you can practice to make sure you're understanding the material that we're learning. So an example of this could be like in America, you can drive at 16 years old, right? That's connected to chronological age, or maybe at a certain age you start, and especially in cultures that have a lot of white noise or sound, like hair dryers and things like that, you might start experiencing presbycusis. And that is a decline in your hearing receptors. So it may make it so it's harder to hear higher frequency sounds or being able to hear what people are saying. Then we also have normative history graded influences. And these are things that influence development connected to particular historical events. So what are examples of these? And I bet y'all can talk about one right now. Yes, I am Dora Exploring You, where I ask questions and hopefully you're responding to the screen. COVID's a huge one, right? So our book mentioned things like World War II or Vietnam War or the Great Depression, things like that. We are going through one of these right now, and there's things that we're going through now that will influence the development of people within the world, worldwide, that will influence us probably for the rest of our lives. There's probably some characteristics and things that will influence how we develop now that may not be true after we're through this whole thing. There's also some non-normative influences not connected to age or history or social expectation. So what were some examples of these? So the book mentioned things like getting a master's degree or having a particular job. So these are things that influence development that are not connected for everyone, right? They're not related to your age. They're not related to historical events or social expectations. These are things that you may choose yourself. Sometimes they might not be, though. We also need to talk about cohorts. So a cohort are the people you travel through time with. So the book mentions it specifically with a birth cohort, but even in things like graduate school, they'll say that you're in a cohort. So these are the people you go into grad school at the same time with, So I thought there was a really cool quote in our materials. It says, these are the people you share history and context for living. And as you age, you start to understand that people have different worldviews and framework, not just because it's like politics or something like that, but because they grew up in the same historical time, that they have different prior knowledge and different contexts and different understanding of things because of how things develop. So I will have a poll everywhere in our module materials that I want you to fill out. You'll notice that there are a lot of different majors within this class, and I like to do this as a way to get to know my online class. So look for that in our module materials. Okay, so that leads us on to research in lifespan development. Introduction to research. Like you might be saying, why are we talking about research and lifespan development? Everything that we learn in this book comes from research studies. And we started to talk about that a little bit earlier in the lecture. Everything in psychological science comes from research, and that's how we learn about human behavior. That's how we try to make discoveries about what's going on across the lifespan, and all these different developmental theories hopefully came from research. If I know they didn't, we'll talk about it when we get to them. All right. So again, everything in psychological science is founded in research. You might be saying, hey, I'm not a psychological science major. This is technically a psychological science course. It's a major course, but it's also a major course for our educators and a whole bunch of other fields too. But everything developmental science, like I'm teaching you, is found in research. So scientific methods, basically a lot of times, I also am a statistics teacher. I also teach research methods as well. And so anytime that we start thinking about scientific methods, we're basically just wanting to seek the truth. And I think there's something beautiful about that. When I train students in doing research, the very first place we're going to start is start reading the scientific literature. So these are articles that are in peer-reviewed journal articles. So peer-reviewed journal articles are basically you have experts in the field and they'll review people's science or their manuscripts for the science that they did. And they'll have three really smart experts try to decide, hey, should we publish this in our journal? And so when we start out trying to seek a question, we need to have a foundation. We need to know the culture of the research. And so we'll read these different peer-reviewed journal articles to see, one, is our question already answered? Are there 1,000 studies on why learning styles are not real? There are probably 1,000 studies on why learning styles are actually a myth. So we'll talk about that later on. And if so, then if your study's not contributing anything new, you really shouldn't do it. So then you would take the information that you gain from reading the literature, you're going to develop a research question, which is answered by either your research or your null hypothesis. So you'll formally write those hypotheses. And then you'll use data, you'll collect quantitative data. Some people do qualitative. This is a little bit different, but I would say we would take data and then make decisions about those formal hypotheses that we created. And then you report your results. So quantitative versus qualitative research, they both have a place for sure. There's a huge war, civil war within the world about which one's better, but they both offer different things. So for example, in quantitative research, we get meaning from numbers. So if you've ever taken a survey that says, how do you feel about this from a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the worst thing ever and 10 being the best thing ever? That's something called a Likert scale. You've probably heard it called a Likert scale. That is a mispronunciation of the scale. It's Likert, like you're licking an ice cream cone. That is technically quantitative research, right? So they're putting meaning to numbers and then evaluating those numbers to see if there's significant differences, or using those numbers to describe something with percentages or means and medians. And then qualitative research, we get meaning from words. So there's a whole bunch of different research designs that can do qualitative research, but this could be where they have people do interviews with someone and they ask open-ended questions and then go through all the different interviews to find common themes across experiences. And so if you can see here, there's actually benefits and negative consequences to both of these types. And that is why some people prefer a mixed method where you use both quantitative and qualitative research to explore a question. And so people have benefits to both. If you're interested in learning more about this, there's definitely different classes on this at the university. I teach the 3100 research methods course for psychological science, and I believe health studies and nutrition kinesiology. I'm not sure if all of those now require the class, but it is available for that. So quantitative research, there's different kinds. There's something called descriptive statistics. So this is where you just describe your data set. So this could be a mean, right? Most people know what an average is, or a mean, or a standard deviation, and that just describes what your data set is saying. Another type of quantitative research is inferential statistics, and that's where we look at a population. So a population is every case given whatever definition you're saying. So if I was interested in studying Americans, this would be every single American that's alive when I'm doing the study. That would be the population. But with inferential statistics, you take a smaller subset of the population called a sample, and you analyze that data so that you can make guesses about what's going on in the overall population. So when doing research, it's really important to have representative samples of the population that you're trying to understand. So that's saying that if you see at the graphic on this slide, it's seeing that different groups are properly represented in the sample so that their experience is not discounted. All right, so there's a convenient sample. These are samples that you take just because you have easy access to them. So if you're walking over to Ellis to go for lunch, and you see the tables where like, do you have time to answer a question? They are taking a convenient sample. They are adding people to their research study because they just walked by them. A lot of times you'll see this if you are in psychological science, we require that students do research projects, right? And so if you use the SONA system, which is a system where Gen Psych students volunteer their time to do a research study, those convenient samples, that's a convenient sample if we're using the SONA system because we had Gen Psych students, and so they became our sample. A random sample, which is ideal, is basically you have every member of the population. So if we go back to the example where we're talking about Americans, we'd have to have information for all Americans, and then basically get a big claw machine and randomly pull people into our sample. So that one can happen, and researchers do it all the time. But it's a little bit harder because one, you have to really define your population and maybe narrowly define it. And then you have to make sure that every member of that population that you're wanting to study has an equal chance of being drawn into your sample. There's also something called a stratified sample. So that's, if you see our picture here, that's making sure that certain percentages of people are represented in your sample. And so this could be based on race, ethnicity. This could be based on highest level education. This could be based on whether you live in the city or the suburbs or the country. There's many different ways that you could stratify a sample. So there's a bunch of different types of research that you can do. We're going to go over a few of them now. So with lifespan development, one of the most common types of design is called a longitudinal design. So this is where scientists follow a cohort of participants or subjects over a period of time. And that allows them to see, okay, how does this particular thing unfold over time? What is the common type of development for these participants? So although that's great, you can definitely follow people across their entire lifespan. There's actually a really cool documentary called 7UP where they went back every 7 years and talked to participants, and the film director actually passed away, so I don't know if they're going to continue it or not, but it's really fun to go back and see who this person was at age 7 and 14 and 21 and 28 and all the way through the entire lifespan. But there's a limitation in that your cohort of subjects have shared history. So if we remember back when we defined cohort earlier in this lecture, there's different experiences with cohort, with different historical events, different worldviews, different experiences that may not extend to other cohorts. And that is why they have another type of research design called cross-sectional research design. This examines multiple ages at one point in time. So if I wanted to look at how does reading develop across high school, I could do a longitudinal design where I follow participants from 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, or I could do a cross-sectional design where I look at all the 9th graders, all the 10th graders, all the 11th graders, and all the 12th graders at the very same time to see what the differences in reading level are. And so one advantage of this is that it's a lot easier to do. You just do at one point in time. You don't have to follow participants. You don't have to worry about participants attritioning out of your study or quitting your study. You just get your data at one point. A problem with this, though, is we don't know if you have differences, if those are differences in cohorts, or if it's actual changes in the development of how reading changes across high school. All right, so that's why sometimes people will do sequential design, and that combines both longitudinal and cross-sectional research. So for example, you could follow a group of 9th graders and follow 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. The next year, follow 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th, and keep doing that for 4 different years, right? You could follow that across the time and compare them all at the same time as well. There's correlational research. I have a little screenshot here that says, does anyone have a favorite article of how correlation was misapplied? I'm trying to find a really good example of how correlational research is abused. And one of my friends said, I believe you're referring to the entire internet. And I laughed. because it's true. Correlational research is the most abused type of research design in the world. All correlational research does is see if there's a relationship between or among variables. So, for example, is there a relationship between how much sleep someone gets the night before an exam and how well they do on a test? So in that example, if we see that there is a positive correlation, we're saying that as you got more sleep, your test score went up. That doesn't mean the sleep caused someone to get a better score. It could be if we did a different type of research design. But with a correlational research design, we can just say they're related. We can't say that one caused another. Okay, so and again, I'm going to reiterate this. If you have taken stats with me or you're going to take stats with me, this is something I'll reiterate there too. You cannot say that one variable causes another one with this type of research design. We're just seeing if they're related. Again, this is one of the most abused types of research. And you hear it, I don't know if you listen to the radio. When I was younger, there used to be newspapers, right? And then my generation, we got our news from the internet. So like newspapers was like died out. I remember my dad reading it. Now the radio, I think, is my generation, because Spotify and Pandora and all these different things have kind of killed the radio. But if you listen to the radio or watch TV or you read the New York Times, they'll say they found a correlation between drinking wine and long life. Well, you actually cannot determine that wine made you live longer. And they've done a lot of other studies on that and actually found that it does not help across the lifespan. But when we're looking at it, you would actually have to do a true experiment to be able to determine to say that one thing caused another. So for example, like we'd have to take people across their whole lifespan, assign people randomly to be either in they get to drink wine condition and they don't get, the other group doesn't get to drink wine, and then follow them across their whole life. So if you're in the do not drink wine, you can never have it. And if you are in the do drink wine, you have to drink it and see which group lives longer. And you can't do that. So why are variables related? You could have variable A cause variable B. Variable B could cause variable A. Something else could cause both variable A and variable B, or there really isn't a relationship between the two. So if we apply an example for this, let's say we want to see, is there a relationship between the number of kids someone has? No, let's not do that. Let's say, is there a relationship between the number of donuts someone eats and the number of times that they have been to the zoo in the past year, right? So we can't say that the number of donuts that you ate in a year caused you to go to the zoo more often, right? And conversely, we can't say with a correlation that going to the zoo more often made you eat more donuts. And you could say that, right? So there could be 4 reasons. 1, eating the donuts caused you to go to the zoo more often. Going to the zoo eating donuts caused you to go to the zoo caused you to eat more donuts, or something else like having kids made both of those numbers go up. Or if there is a relationship, it could be something called a spurious correlation, where the two are not actually related, but it just happened. Okay, and so whenever we have a correlation, one of these 4 could be the answer to your solution of why you have a correlation, but we can't identify which one. All right, so for example, there's a really funny website called tylervigen.com, and he finds all these correlations that are funny. So like there is a correlation between the number of people who drowned by falling into a swimming pool with the number of films that Nicolas Cage appeared in. I don't know why that's funny. It should be actually kind of morbid, actually, right? But if you look here, Nicolas Cage appearing in a film did not cause people to drown by falling into a pool, right? Or people drowning and falling into a pool probably did not cause Nicolas Cage to appear in more films. And there's not something else that probably caused both of those happen. That is most likely a spurious correlation. It's probably not a real relationship. It just was a fluke and it happened to happen. There's also something called a naturalistic observation, and this involves directly observing behavior outside of the laboratory in an environment where it typically occurs, while taking great care to avoid interfering with the behavior under investigation. So, for example, school psychologists, when we're working within education systems, we will go observe students that we're evaluating for special education services. So if you have a school psychologist and your teacher come into your classroom, you don't want to point out who the kid is. You don't want to draw attention to the school psychologist at all because they're trying to observe the behavior so that they can determine one, is there a problem? Two, if there is a problem, what do they think is going on? And they'll do something called a FBA, which we'll learn about later on in the semester to try to determine the function of behavior if there's problem behaviors going on. So that's an applied situation where there's naturalistic observation. There's also something called self-report. And this is any kind of measurement technique that directly asks participants how they think or feel. So you've probably done tons of those surveys before. We are inundated with surveys about everything all the time. That is a self-report. There's actually some huge problems with self-report research, but you can learn more about that in a research methods class. And in self-reports, you quantify internal events. So that Likert scale that I told you about earlier is a very common one. It could be a symptom checklist. There's a number of things it could be. One of the problems with self-report is social desirability. People tend to want to make themselves look good. And so if you're not careful, you can prime people to lie to you. Also demand characteristics. There's different types of effects that you can learn about, but a lot of times participants either want to help the research or not. And if it is designed, your self-report stays designed in a certain way, that can influence and cause more issues with demand characteristics. We're also very biased as humans. There's something called retroactive bias where we actually don't remember our lives very well. And we'll learn more about that when we start talking about information processing and working memory. So true experiment, this is how we determine cause and effect. So this is when we have a sample of participants and we randomly assign our participants to different conditions or different groups. And then a lot of times we'll try to see, are there significant differences between those groups or among those groups? So in these type of studies, the dependent variable is what you're measuring. So if you're doing a study to see, do people eat street tacos during a week, or do street tacos cause people to be happier? The dependent variable would be happiness. And then the independent variable would be the different groups or conditions. So in that case, whether or not they're in the condition that gets to eat street tacos or in the condition that doesn't get to eat street tacos. There's also quasi-experimental research. And this is designs where we cannot manipulate the independent variable. So these are pre-existing conditions. So when we were talking about cross-sectional research design earlier, and I used the example about following reading levels across high school in the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, that type of research design is quasi-experimental because we cannot randomly assign our participants to be in the 9th, 10th, 11th, or 12th grade. So we're using pre-existing groups or conditions and examining the differences among them. So these are my references. We're through lecture this week. I hope this was helpful for you. I look forward to learning more about each of you, and I will talk to you soon.